Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to get started. Welcome to our webinar today for social emotional learning. And this is a little bit different this year. We were looking at doing examples of practice, and we will be doing that in the future, but I'm very excited to be able to introduce you to Dr. Clark McGowan. I did send out his synopsis of what this talk will be about, as well as his biography, but I think one of the things I'd really like to stress is that he is a nationally recognized expert in this field, and I attended one of his sessions at the SEL Exchange in October and realized that there was nuances about SEL assessment I hadn't even considered. And he's been very, very gracious with his time and consultation to help us look at how we want to frame assessment here in Wisconsin. And so I'm going to just put myself on mute and let Dr. McGowan take over here, tell you maybe a little bit more about himself as well. Know that if you would like to ask questions at any time through this webinar, please feel free to put those questions in the chat box. I will share them with Dr. McGowan when there's a logical lull to be able to do that. You don't need to wait till the end, although we will also leave some time at the end. There's a lot to consider with assessment, and I'm fascinated by the whole topic, and I think that you'll find this to be a really helpful and useful session. So Dr. McGowan, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Beth. Thank you very much for having me too. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with your colleagues. And it's nice to meet everyone, although this is a different way than meeting face-to-face. I'd love to be in a room with you all instead of over Zoom, but it's a pretty good approximation, I suppose, of a face-to-face meeting. And I appreciate your kind words, Beth. A couple of things, just so you know where I'm coming from. I am a faculty member at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, where my colleagues and I have been engaged in a program of work on SEL assessment, essentially, for the last 12 or 15 years. The focus of our work began with trying to figure out whether there were better ways than just teacher rating scales or self-report questionnaires to measure the competencies that children need to interact effectively with others, to participate in group activities like being in a classroom, and to succeed across a range of different contexts. And we, excuse me, we first tested kind of measures that were used in the research literature to get at children's thinking about the social world. And then we got funding from the Institute of Education Sciences to develop web-based tools to assess children's social and emotional competence. And ever since, we've really been trying to develop and validate and disseminate assessment tools that educators can use to guide instruction. So, and I started this company, Excel Labs, as a spinoff from the university to disseminate our assessments post-validation. So I tell you that by way of giving you a sense of where I'm coming from. I think about SEL assessment every day, pretty much all day. I think it's fascinating too. You know, I think when it comes right down to it for me, the most interesting thing about the challenge of SEL assessment is, how do you ask a child, particularly a young child, but really any child, a question so that you get a meaningful answer about their social and emotional competence? It's a deceptively simple question to ask, and it's not such an easy thing to do. So let's talk a little bit about some of the considerations. Now, I will say I recognize something about myself, speaking of self-awareness in giving presentations, that often I'll present a lot of stuff and then reveal the kind of major headline or conclusion at the end. I've decided to try to flip that as a general practice. So I'm going to start with what I think is one of the main messages that I'd like to communicate to you today. Let's see if I can get the PowerPoint to, oh, there, okay. So the main point of today's presentation, if you get nothing else out of it, I hope that you get this that social emotional competence assessment can be used to guide social emotional instruction and social emotional practices, much in the way that a high quality formative math assessment can guide math instruction. The reason I start with that, and that is the main point I'd like you to take away from this, is that Beth and I were talking about this recently. I've given a number of workshops recently about SEL assessment for educators. And one of the things I always do is ask people in the workshop who's doing SEL assessment. And then for those who are doing SEL assessment, I'll ask them, what are you using to assess social and emotional competence? And inevitably, most of the people will say something like the SABRS, or another instrument that's designed to screen a population of students to identify students who are at risk for emotional, behavioral, or academic challenges. Now, in my view, that's an important thing to do, but that's not really assessing social and emotional competence. That's identifying problems. And I understand why that's where people start from. It's the kind of closest approximation to social emotional competence assessment in many people's minds. But what I hope to communicate to you is that there are other ways of thinking about social and emotional competence assessment that really move it from being a tool for identifying problems to a tool for instructional planning. How might you collect data efficiently about student social and emotional competence in ways that teachers and administrators can use to plan what to teach to whom at what point, right? That's a very different exercise than identifying students who are at risk. So let's start by talking about the elements of social and emotional competence assessment. Well, let's start with what I think is a good idea to do before you even select an assessment to use if you're inclined to assess competence. One question I encourage you to ask yourselves and to discuss amongst your colleagues is what exactly do you want to assess? It's really important. I mean, I think that because SEL assessment is kind of new, I get a lot of calls from people saying, we know we have to assess something. Can we just use the SABRS? And I say, well, do you want to assess internalizing, externalizing, and academic problems? Is that the thing that's most important to you? And they say, well, I don't know. We haven't really worked that out. Well, I really encourage you to work that out first. And one of the things you have going for yourselves as Wisconsin educators is that the state has adopted competencies, or I don't think that the state calls them standards, but I will use that word from time to time because I think it communicates fairly clearly. Basically, the state has adopted a document that says these are the competencies, the social and emotional competencies that children should know and be able to demonstrate at different ages and different grades. And so that's a great place to look to say, well, what of these things in the standards or the Wisconsin competencies are the things that we really want to focus on, okay? And then a second important question that often gets skipped over that I think is really, really important is how do you intend to use the assessment data? When not all assessment data is the same, and not all decisions that you make based on assessment data are the same. Okay, I hate to keep hammering on the SABRS. It's a wonderful instrument for its purpose, and its purpose is identification of risk. So, when you use the SABRS, the intended use of the assessment data is to figure out which of the kids in the group of kids who you have data on are most likely to have some form of problem, internalizing, externalizing, or academic problems. That is one kind of use of assessment. There are many other uses of assessment data. One, for example, is using assessment data to guide instructional practices. That's more of a kind of formative intention or instructional planning purpose of assessment. Another is to measure students' progress after a period of instruction. The kids learn the material that you intended to teach them. Another related purpose is program evaluation. There are lots of different goals that you could consider adopting when you do SEL assessment. And I think I just strongly encourage you to be intentional and specific about the assessment goals that you want to pursue, because for a couple reasons. One is that the clearer you can be to your community, both of educators and parents, about what you're assessing and why you're assessing it, the more everybody can kind of be on the same page, and the more you can address questions that come up about, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Well, you have your answer. You figured it out ahead of time. And the other thing is, I think when you don't have a clear plan for how the data are going to be used, it's very easy to collect assessment data and either not use it or have a kind of mushy use or lots of different decisions being made based on the assessment data that aren't necessarily justified by the technical properties of the assessment. Okay, I don't want to ramble on too much about that, but I guess I probably made my point that I really strongly encourage you to consider what you want to assess and what you want to do with the assessment data before you pick an assessment instrument. And in fact, then I think you're set up to pick an assessment that's the right tool for the job, because you figured out what you want to assess and what you want to do with the assessment data. Then you can look at the range of assessments that are available and say, hey, does this assessment that I'm considering measure what I want to assess, and is it capable of achieving my assessment goals, right? So that's why those two things are so important before selecting an assessment. And then once you've selected an assessment, when and how you gather the assessment data is an important consideration. If you're looking at kind of program evaluation exclusively, a sort of summative goal of SEL assessment, then maybe collecting the data at the end of the school year is sufficient. If you're looking to use SEL assessment as an instructional planning tool or for formative purposes, then collecting good assessment data early in the school year, and then maybe an interim, and then later in the school year to really be able to get a sense of what students' strengths are, what students' needs are, so that you can base your instructional plan on assessed needs and strengths is important. So your goals will kind of dictate when and how you gather the assessment data. And then finally, and this is really important too, is once you've assessed students, what do you do with your assessment data? I've talked to lots of groups of educators, and what's struck me is the incredible variability in the extent to which building level teams and district level teams have routines and practices for regularly reviewing academic assessment data and making instructional decisions based on the data. And the sort of continuum seems to be from very rarely, if at all, do we get together to talk about our assessment data to actually we do this about once a month, and we have a fairly structured process for doing so. And for those of you who are in settings where there's already a kind of data culture and data review practices in place, it's much easier because you can integrate social and emotional data along with reading and math. So you can use existing structures to make sense of and make decisions based on the data. For those of you who don't have a tradition of data use, or you're just establishing it, then getting that set up is a kind of important precursor to being able to use SEL assessment data well. Okay. So let's talk about the what for a second, because you might say, well, okay, Clark, it's a great idea to decide what to assess first, but how do we go about that? I can't tell you specifically what is most important for you to measure, but I can point you to a couple of places where you might turn to engage in a discussion in your community about what's most important. First is, I think you want to measure skills that matter, or competencies that matter. And this wheel is probably familiar to many of you. It's basically the model of social and emotional competence that the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL, has put out in the world for many years now. And it has a description of 5 broad competencies that we know when students develop it, it's really good for them. It's good for their ability to participate in collective life, and it's good for their outcomes, including academic outcomes. So I encourage you to think of, whether it's the CASEL model or some other model, to have a kind of coherent theory that you're you're drawing your competencies from. A second natural place to look for the what, as I mentioned earlier, is in state standards. So you have, you're a click away from the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction's SEL resources that describe the competencies that students at different grades should know and be able to demonstrate. They describe very specifically those competencies, and so it's a great source of information about what you might focus on in doing assessment. A third consideration that I think is really important is, what's a priority locally in your community? Beth and I were talking yesterday, and she said that there was a district, Beth, you'll correct me if I get this wrong, but that decided to survey the community to say, hey, what of these social and emotional competencies are most important to you? And so they actually systematically collected data about what the sort of local values and priorities were, and accounted for that survey data in selecting the competencies they were going to focus on. And then finally, I think it's important to focus on assessing the competencies that you plan to teach to the extent that you can. So if you've identified some competencies in the standards that you think are high priority, that are important locally, the good thing about the Wisconsin standards is that they're already sort of based largely on the CASEL model, so you don't have to worry about this so much. So if you've got this one, and this one worked out, I really think the question is, where is the overlap between standards, local priorities, and what you plan to teach? The overlap in that Venn diagram is, in my view, the ideal set of things, the what, that you want to consider assessing. So you see how different this is from, I don't want to belabor it. I don't think it has to be a horribly tortured process to identify what, but it's really different than saying, hey, I've heard about this assessment, let's just go ahead and use that. Because the odds that an assessment that you randomly pick or you hear about from your network is going to measure what's most important to you in your context are pretty small. All right, so then there's the why, and I'm going to go ahead and define an intended use of assessments that I think is a really important one. It's one that people don't commonly consider SEL assessments for, but that I think that they ought to be doing. And so let's think about SEL assessment for Tier 1, so sort of universal application. And the purpose of assessing children and collecting these data is to guide instruction for everyone, so Tier 1, to evaluate progress as students are exposed to instruction, SEL instruction, and for administrators in particular to make program decisions. If you have good data on the strengths and the needs of a body of students at a school or district level, you can make good decisions, database decisions about the kinds of program resources that are going to be best suited to building on the strengths that have been identified and addressing the needs. And I'm not going to focus on the use of SEL assessment to screen for risk, to diagnose students, or to place students in Tier 2 or Tier 3 interventions, because I actually think, social emotional learning at its best is really about the competencies that we think all children and adults should possess to be successful participants in a range of daily activities. It's really about building strengths, much like math instruction is about building competence in a number of specific math operations and skills, much like reading instruction is about building competence in decoding and fluency. SEL instruction is about building those strengths that we want students to have. So even if you wanted to use a strengths-based SEL assessment for screening, it's a kind of awkward fit because really SEL assessment is not about identifying problems. It's about supporting our efforts to build these strengths. Okay, so once you've got the what, once you've figured out the why, you can make an informed decision about what assessment tool is the best one for the job. And so you might say, well, that's great, Clark. I can figure out the what, I can figure out the why, but how do I know what exists out there? Well, I'm happy to report that there are some resources you can turn to find out what assessments are presently available. CASEL has developed an online assessment guide. And if you go ahead and, whoops, sorry about this. If you go ahead and Google CASEL assessment guide, it'll pop to the top of the search page. And it's a searchable, essentially, database of evidence-based SEL assessments. So it's a really good resource, and it also provides information about some of the technical properties of the assessment, so you can make informed decisions about whether the assessment you're considering is up to the task you want to set for it. A second resource that's similar is an online resource called the RAND Education Assessment Finder. And again, you can Google that and it'll come up, and it's a searchable database of SEL assessments and other kinds of assessments. And finally, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, I think Beth mentioned this, but is about to release a developmental tracker, which is going to be a universally available, I think free, resource for Wisconsin educators that'll include student self-report questionnaires, teacher report questionnaires that measure a variety of social and emotional factors, including students' own competencies, their perceptions of the climate, and so on. So, and then one of the wonderful things about the developmental tracker is that I know that it's being designed to measure the things that are in the Wisconsin state competencies. Okay, so it's sort of ready built for the what, and it's, I think, going to be appropriate for, in particular, formative assessment purposes, not for any kind of high stakes assessment. And in fact, I would argue that there is really no SEL assessment out there that's capable of a kind of high stakes accountability function. And it's arguable whether there ever should be. Now, I did see, Beth, I think that there are some comments in the chat box, so I'm going to take a pause here and just see if we want to tackle any of those questions or comments.
Yeah, we did have somebody that asked if anybody had used Panorama or Illuminate Education. So if any of the attendees have, and they would like to put a message in reply to Susie for that. And I put the links that you have in your PowerPoint into the chat box. So people will have access to this PowerPoint, but if they're interested in looking at the CASEL Assessment Guide and the RAND Guide, the links are there for that. And then thank you for the nod about the developmental tracker. We're hoping to actually make that public release by Friday.
Fantastic. Okay, good. Excellent. All right, onward then. Let's talk for a second about the kinds of assessments that are generally available to you if you want to use SEL assessment as an instructional planning tool. You've got self-report questionnaires, and so a self-report questionnaire works something like this. Students see a bunch of items that maybe are statements about their own competencies. In this case, I understand what other people feel. And then they rate how true those statements are. Not at all true to extremely true. Sometimes they're framed in terms of how often you do these different things. But in any case, it's students reporting on their own level of competence. Panorama, somebody mentioned Panorama. They have student self-report questionnaires that focus on competencies in much this way. Teacher rating scales or teacher report is, you're probably familiar with this, but This is where the statements are about a particular student, and a teacher rates how frequently the child engages in those behaviors. So a teacher report item might be understands what peers are feeling, almost never to almost always. So again, the teachers are rating the frequency of behaviors that reflect social and emotional competence. A less well-known form of assessment is direct assessment, and this is what our company does. We've created and validated direct assessments for kindergarten through 6th grade. And so in a direct assessment, rather than a child reporting on his or her own competence or a teacher rating the frequency of behaviors, the child completes a series of challenging tasks where they have to show what they know. They have to demonstrate their competence. So here, the child rated how good he is at knowing what other people feel. The teacher rated how good the student is at knowing what other people feel. Here we show the child a picture of a face, and they have to say, is the person happy, sad, angry, scared, or just okay? Okay, so direct assessment is a way of asking students to show us what they know, to demonstrate their competence rather than tell us about their competence. And a final common method of assessment of SEL is administrative records. Things like office discipline referrals and suspensions and tardiness and things like that. I am not a big fan of administrative records as a measure of social and emotional competence. I do think they're important indicators of something, but you know, the things that can contribute to discipline referrals, yet maybe social and emotional competence is one of those contributors, but it could be a whole host of other things that are causing students to be referred for discipline. So I think that a lot of administrative records are kind of like, they're a little distal from the competencies that we're trying to teach. And so if I had my druthers, I'd want you to be assessing the competencies themselves, not things that are in part a product of those competencies. And we have tools to do that: self-report, teacher report, and direct assessment. There are other methods too, but I think these are the most frequently deployed for instructional planning purposes. So let's take a moment to focus on what might you do with your assessment data once you gather it. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through a kind of brief case study, and in in-person workshops, I'll often do this more interactively, where I will walk through a kind of set of circumstances, ask people to imagine they were in that circumstance, and then share with them some data and walk through a process of data review that I think can be quite effective as a model for structuring data review meetings, because we don't really have the luxury, unfortunately, of that kind of interactive experience. I'm going to talk you through what that might look like. So I want you to imagine that I'm still going to ask you to do some mental simulation, okay? And I want you to imagine that this is your situation. You're using this social and emotional learning curriculum, Sanford Harmony. It's widely available. It's one of the evidence-based SEL programs. There are others that are commonly used: Second Step, Move This World, Open Circle, Getting Along Together. There are a whole bunch, and you probably already know this, but CASEL, in addition to having an assessment guide online, has program guides for the elementary and secondary levels that list widely available and effective social and emotional learning curricula or programs. So if you're searching for a program, I highly recommend going to the CASEL guides to get a sense of what the universe of alternatives for you is. But in this case, you've settled on Sanford Harmony, for example. And in addition, you've decided to use a direct assessment of competencies that you know are the target of instruction in Sanford Harmony. Because I'm most familiar with it, I'm going to give you an example of this is our assessment, which is called CEL-Web. And it's designed to measure emotion recognition, social perspective taking. We also have a vignette-based social problem-solving task, and a couple of different dimensions of self-management. And so you've picked this curriculum, and you're going to pair it with this assessment. And your assessment goal, in this case, you've decided that the goal is to use the SEL assessment again, as an instructional planning tool, not to screen and identify kids for problems, not to summatively evaluate how they did at the end of instruction, but you want to use it as a tool for planning instruction. Now, this is part of the reason why you are pairing this curriculum with this assessment. Now, let me walk you through what this table is all about. This is the scope and sequence of the first and second grade lessons from Sanford Harmony. Okay, these are the units. Each line is one of the lessons. Each of these columns is one of the competencies that the assessment is designed to measure: how well kids understand others' feelings, how well children take others' perspectives or perspective taking, how well children are able to come to grips with and resolve social problems, and how well kids are able to manage themselves or engage in self-control. And wherever there's a check mark, it means that the lesson is designed to teach that competence. If there are two check marks, it means that this competence is really a strong and central focus of the lesson. So what you see in this table is that every lesson is designed to teach at least one of the competencies that the assessment is designed to measure. And every competence the assessment is designed to measure is taught by multiple lessons. And so I think you can begin to imagine how you might then take assessment data about where the strengths and the needs of different students are and use it to make decisions about what parts of the scope and sequence to focus on, to emphasize. It's not like you have to reinvent anything, but you can our hope is that you can use assessment data to guide the way that you use the instructional resources in a way that maximizes its benefit, okay? So here's the way you're gonna do that. Here's your practice model. Here's a school year from fall to spring. And your plan is to assess social emotional competencies in the fall. And soon thereafter, as a team, you're gonna review the assessment data. You're gonna review it in a way that you can really come to some strong hypotheses about where the strengths are, where the needs are, and you're going to use that then to make decisions about how to use your scope and sequence to maximum benefit, and you're going to go ahead and execute that plan. And then after a period of instruction, you're going to reassess social and emotional competencies to measure progress, and you're going to review the data to look at how students did. Okay, this is the practice model that, oh, and then you're going to repeat. So this is really a kind of continuous improvement loop where social and emotional instruction is informed by data, and the progress that students make is informed by data too. And you can use the spring data, the after a period of instruction data, formatively to guide instruction in the fall, kind of continuous improvement loop. I would add that it would be an easy thing, or actually a desirable thing, I'm not sure how easy it would be, but a desirable thing also to measure students' perception of the conditions of learning or the climate, how much students feel safe, how much they feel they have positive relationships with teachers and other students, how much they feel that they're engaged in the instruction. So you could use climate data and competence data together in this same kind of model to make decisions both about what skills do we want to be focused on teaching the students, and what can we do as adults to build the most positive climate we can to support that skill development. So that's the practice model. So now I want you to imagine that you've done this, you've done your assessment in the fall, and now it's time to review your data. And here is an example of one classroom's worth of data, okay? And let me walk you through how this performance plot works. Each of these bars represents one of the competencies that the assessment measures. This bar is emotion recognition, this one's social perspective taking, this one's social problem solving, this one is self-control, and here is a kind of overall composite that is made up of all of these different competencies. Within each of the bars, the light green part shows the percentage of students who scored well above average. This is a norm reference test. This slightly darker green bar shows the percentage of students who are in the average range. This shows the percentage of students who are a little below average, and this shows the percentage of students who are well below average. Okay, so it's a familiar plot for many educators. I think you see this kind of data presented for reading and math. This plot is for a particular classroom, so it's 26 students in one class. Now, it's possible to get this kind of performance plot at the grade level within a school, at the school level, and at the district level, and each one of those kinds of plots can be useful for different purposes. Now, if we were in a room together and I were able to walk you through this, what I would do is describe a particular method of discussing assessment data that kind of systematizes the process of interpretation. And I call this See, Think, Wonder. And it's actually based on a process of art appreciation that I think is used in secondary schools, where when students are going through a museum, teachers encourage them to look at the painting or whatever the piece of art is, and first of all, just to notice what they see. Literally, what do they see? What are the colors? What are the textures? What are the surface features of the art? And spend some time on that, just coming to grips with what the fact of the art is. And then after that, they're encouraged to consider, what does that make them think? What does it make them think? So starting to go beyond the surface features of the art to interpret what associations they have with that piece of art. And then finally, they're asked to say what it makes them wonder. And this is where curiosity and hypotheses and questions about the art can come in. And I actually think, so that's about art, but there's a very similar kind of utility in that kind of process in data. Because what we can do first is say, well, what do we see? What are the kind of surface level features of this performance plot that we notice? And we're going to try to be disciplined about not interpreting or wondering. And I'll give you some examples, since we can't do this as an interactive exercise, but let's see, I see that 15% of students perform well above average on emotion recognition. I see a lot of this kind of light green color right here, that's one of the bigger bands. I see that the same number of students are well below average in emotion recognition and social problem solving. I see that 69% of students are in the average range or above on emotion recognition. I also see that 50% of students are in the average range or above in social problem solving. So you see what I'm doing? I'm really not being very creative in some ways. I'm just describing the surface features of the data, but these are things that are sort of jumping out to me. And I'm trying to be rooted in the facts. And the purpose of this is that it's very easy. We are storytelling beings, and data interpretation is a very human exercise. And so it's easy for us as storytelling beings to kind of jump to one feature of the data and come to all kinds of conclusions about it. And this helps us to be disciplined, say we're going to try to come to grips with the facts first before we start interpreting. So I've seen all those things, and then the question for the group is, what does that make you think? And let's see, it makes me think that emotion recognition for this group of students is a relative strength, because it is the competence that has the highest proportion of students in the average range or above, even though there are some students struggling. It makes me think that social problem solving for this group of students is an area of relative need, because 50% of students are in the average range or above, and 50% are a little below or well below average. It makes me think that social perspective taking is in a similar range. And so those are some of the things that are kind of think processes. You're starting to make judgments about the data. It's not just the facts of how much is green, what the percentages are, relative strengths, relative weaknesses, is starting to be an interpretive judgment of what the data means, okay? And then you go on to the wonder stage. And so the question is, what does this make you wonder? And so I might say, I wonder if the challenges of this class of students has with social problem solving might explain why we're having such a hard time doing cooperative learning effectively. I wonder if we might celebrate the skills of emotion recognition in the class and have students show their skills in this area. I wonder if these students who are well below average are all the same students, or whether there are different students who have struggles in different areas. I wonder if we might focus on social problem solving as a kind of focus area in instruction moving forward. Okay, so you're starting to go beyond just interpreting, what the meaning of the data is to making some hypotheses about how these patterns of strengths and needs might explain things that you're seeing, and what you might do in the future based on what you've learned from the data. Okay. So it's not nearly as good for me to do the seeing, thinking, and wondering as it is for you to do it. I will say that, and I'll show you a screenshot of this near the end. I've written a book on social and emotional competence assessment, and it walks through the see, think, wonder procedure and kind of structuring data review meetings. So if you're interested in pursuing that, that's a good resource for going through this in more depth. And it's really very step-by-step, so you can follow the process fairly straightforwardly. Okay, so you've got the data. You've collected it in the fall. In this class, you've sort of pegged social problem solving as a kind of focus area and perspective taking as a secondary focus area. So then the question is, what do you do with that? What decision can you make based on that understanding of student strengths and needs? Well, the question is, in light of the assessment data, how might you use these program resources to build on student strengths and address students' needs? Now, if you take a look at this scope and sequence, remember, social problem solving was one of the areas of need. And let's take a look at social problem solving. Well, the lessons that are focused on social problem solving are all the way here at the end of the scope and sequence. So, one of the things that I might consider were I this teacher is, could we preview some of these lessons, move them earlier in the scope and sequence, and give students a chance to reinforce these competencies even as we're teaching other competencies in the scope and sequence. We could do the same with perspective taking, but the good news is it looks like social perspective taking is really a focus early on in the scope and sequence. So we want to maintain that and want to kind of add a little bit of robustness to this. So you see, we're using tier 1 data for the whole classroom to make decisions about tier 1 instruction. I hope this sounds reasonable to you, and you can see how you might do this. I think that for many educators, it's not intuitive that this is even possible, but I strongly believe it is, and could really help teachers make good decisions about how to use the resources that they have available to them, and maybe even help them engage in the curriculum in a really constructive way. So, okay, so this is the scope and sequence, what you can do with your scope and sequence, but there are lots of opportunities in a classroom to reinforce social and emotional competencies. So another question is, in light of the assessment data, how might you coach teachers to find creative ways to build on strengths and needs? the Learning Policy Institute recently had a webinar, and they have this infographic on their website, which I love, because it basically shows all kinds of ways within the course of the day that a teacher can set things up for reinforcing lessons in the curriculum. So like students can learn skills in the context of cooperative learning. Students can learn skills when they get into conflicts on the playground or in the cafeteria. That's an opportunity to teach problem-solving skills. Students can do self-directed work to work on self-management. You know, the students teachers can integrate lessons on social and emotional along with academic work. I think of, you know, young children in kindergarten, first grade class teachers reading to them, and almost every storybook has a problem. Any good story has a problem in it that needs resolving. And so questions even about like, what do you think this person is feeling and how do you know? What do you think the problem is? All of these things are good literacy lessons, and they're good social and emotional lessons too. So the question is, could you use that data that we reviewed, that performance plot, both to make decisions about the use of the scope and sequence, and to discuss creative ways that some of the competencies that are the focus based on the data could be reinforced throughout the course of the day. Okay, so you come to some decisions about how to use the scope and sequence, about what you might do throughout the course of the day to reinforce competencies. You execute the plan. And then the plan is based on the data. You've made decisions, you execute. After a period of instruction, reassess and take a look at the results. And so here's an example of the same kind of performance plot, but this time each of the pairs of bars shows fall results and spring results for that same group of students. And each of the pairs of bars is one of the competency areas. And so if we go back to social problem solving, which was our focus, remember 50% of kids were in the average range or above at the beginning. Well, at the end, 70% of kids are in the average range or above. So it really looks like things were moving in the right direction for this group of students. Is there still work to be done? Absolutely. But it gives you a sense that, okay, the efforts were taking. And so you've got the formative use of the assessment data in the fall, more of a kind of summative picture of where students progress later in the school year that can then feed into formative use of continued instruction throughout the rest of the school year and potentially into the beginning of the next. Okay, so this is a random slide that I meant to delete before coming on to this webinar, so I apologize, but I do think I'll just walk you through it. I think that having opportunities for review and reflection of data and committing to having the data inform concrete decisions about what to do next are really important elements of data use. Having these two things kind of go in a cyclical fashion in a sort of continuous improvement model, to me is ideal. And I think we are actually in a position as a field to use social emotional competence assessment data in addition to climate assessment data to do continuous improvement of practice to improve teaching, learning, and student outcomes. All right, I know we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to just show you this. I was the lead author on a State of the Field report about SEL assessment, and the point of this slide is basically that I think we're going to be in the best position to use assessment data to really support teaching, learning, and student outcomes when what's being assessed is the same as what we're intending to teach and is the same as the competencies that are codified in state standards. And again, I think Wisconsin's in an awesome position because you've got these articulated competencies at the state level to begin aligning what's happening at this in terms of the standards to what's happening in classrooms, and to use assessments of those same competencies to inform teaching and learning. All this requires professional learning opportunities, and so this is an example, I hope, of an opportunity that helps move this forward a little bit. Okay, so this is the book I've written. It goes into what we discussed today and a whole heck of a lot more. It's designed to be practical and help walk you through the decision making about how to pick the right assessment and then what to do after you've got the assessment data. And this is for those of you who are a little nerdier and want to really go deep into SEL assessment. This is a report on the state of the field of student social and emotional competence assessment that I was lead author on. It was released about a month ago or so. It's a good read if you ask me, but maybe not quite as immediately practical as the book. Okay, if you want to get in touch with me about any of this or anything else related to SEL assessment, this is my contact information, and I encourage you to reach out if you want to set up a Zoom meeting or just talk. And I believe we have, I think I hit the timing right on the nail, or the nail on the head, whatever it is, Beth, for some Q&A at this point.
Absolutely. You landed the plane well.
Thank you.
So does anybody have questions? This is a great opportunity to ask those right now. So if you want to type them in the chat box, and I'm going to throw one at you myself, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So you and I have talked about how SEL skills are so contextual. Do you see a value of using multiple tools to assess a competence, or is that not necessary?
I think it depends on your goals to some degree and what you want to assess. I'll give you an example of where I think it can be helpful to use multiple tools. Some tools are better at assessing kind of the behavioral expression of social and emotional learning. For example, a lot of people complain about teacher rating scales and say, well, it just measures what mood the teacher was in when he or she completed the rating scale. I think they're better than that. And mostly teachers do a really nice job of rating students' behavior. And if you want to get a quick picture of the extent to which students are engaging in the behaviors you want them to, there's really no substitute for a rating scale. If you want to get at the kind of thinking process, how kids make sense of and interpret and work through challenging social and emotional information, direct assessment to me is one of the stronger ways of getting at that. So if you said, look, we want to get at the thinking skills and we want to actually get a picture of behavior, combining direct assessment and rating scales would be a reasonable approach. But I think the question of which ones to combine and how, at its best is a goal-directed endeavor. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to assess? And then let's figure out whether we need to mix different kinds of assessments to get at everything that's important to us.
Thank you. And you were at the beginning kind of really making the point that you've got to know what you want to assess before you start to pick something to assess. And making sure that the curriculum, the graphics that you had about making sure that the curriculum is teaching what you want to teach. I mean, it's all got to go together. So I do have a question, a couple of them from Rose, and I think I'm going to have to ask Rose if you could give us a little more information. It says, where is the infographic about SEL integration available? I need a little more information about what that graphic is, or is this one that you shared, Clark?
I think I know which one she's talking about. Let me see if I can get the PowerPoint to go backwards. I think it was the one that was kind of the infographic of the classroom.
Was it the
that had the? For some reason, PowerPoint is frozen right now, so I can't scroll back to it. But if that is the case, the Learning Policy Institute were the crew that came up with this infographic. They're a think tank research group out of Northern California. If you type in Learning Policy Institute, type in Learning Policy Institute and Social and Emotional Learning webinar, because it was out of a webinar, and it should be in there somewhere. I wish I could be a little more directive for you. I don't have the specific link to that infographic, but that should get you started on the right path to it.
Okay. So I was trying to find this quickly. I can give you guys the Learning Policy Institute link, and then you can dig around on the site. So there's that one. And then Rose also had a question about the name of the report. Are you referring to the report? I think it's the one that you co-author, or the one that you were the lead author on. What is the name of that report?
Yeah, that one is called something like it's a really boring title, so forgive me, but it's something like the State of the Field of Social and Emotional Competence Assessment. I'm actually going to type in a link to that report because I'm delighted that anybody who's interested in reading it. So let me, I'm going to be searching around a little bit for that. And I'll put it in the chat box as soon as I find it.
Okay, and I have another question for you.
Yeah.
SEL competencies are important for all students to be ready to learn and work together. Do you have suggestions about ways to reflect on and draw conclusions about the SEL assessment information and other outcomes such as ODRs, suspensions, and graduation?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, my kind of my nerd dream is for SEL, really high quality SEL assessment data to be integrated in data management systems in a way that it's possible for administrators and others in the school system to be able to look at SEL administrative records and academic data kind of side by side in customized reports that really give you a sense of like, how do these things look when you look at them all together? Right, that I think, so I know there are some people out there who have those kinds of data management systems available that can easily integrate data into the system. So if you're interested in learning more, please give me a ring and we can talk about it. You know, the other thing though, I think there's a kind of research question that's important, which is what is the magnitude of the association between social and emotional competence and things like ODRs? Are they correlated? I'm pretty sure they are, but how big is the correlation? If I were a betting man, I would guess that it's probably about like 0.3 or 0.4, which means that you know, the more you have competence, the less you're likely to get an ODR, but that there are a lot of other things that go into the mix of explaining that too. So, you know, for the kind of practical use of data, I think finding a data management system that can integrate SEL data along with other forms of data is optimal. But from a research point of view, looking at archival data to see what those associations is interesting. Okay. What else? Uh-oh, do I still have you guys?
Wait a minute, I was on mute.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
I'm so relieved. I thought that I was, yeah. So I just so you know, Beth, before you ask the next question, I put a link to the State of the Field report in the chat box for anybody who's interested.
Perfect. Okay, so there was a question about whether or when the Wisconsin assessment tool will be available, and we're hoping that will be Friday. If you're able to stick around, I can kind of give people a little quick look at it before you log off. I'm happy to do that. And then somebody else mentioned that they had been hoping FastBridge would put evaluations of academic alongside SEL, but it appears to be more of a mental health screener, and it's external and internal behavior. I share that because I think you made a really good point at the beginning. SABRS is one of them, but there's a lot of tools that people may be using to assess SEL that aren't really SEL assessments. Would you agree?
I would agree to that. They're perfectly good assessments for a particular purpose. You know, like I feel like every assessment is like you know, go to Home Depot and you go to the tool aisle. Well, there are a million different tools, and each one of them does something really well and doesn't do other things well. Like it's really hard to drill a hole with a saw. You know what I mean? And so I think that the SABRS and other assessments like it are really good at what they are designed to do, which is identify kids who are at risk. But they're just not built to necessarily assess the level of the competencies that we intend to teach. So it's a really different kind of exercise and different kind of assessment goal.
You are being asked if you have a favorite tool. I think
Me?
I might know the answer to that. Yeah.
If you were expecting me to say it depends, then you were right, Beth. It does depend on your goals. I mean, I have to admit I'm partisan because we have a company that sells a particular assessment, and it's a really good one for instructional planning. But it goes from K to 6, and there are other really good tools out there too. So that I'm not just being partisan, I would say that another good tool is the DESA, which is sold by Aperture. It's a teacher rating scale that's focused on sort of strengths-based assessment of social and emotional competencies. I actually think DESA and CellWeb together would be awesome. Somebody said, would I recommend the SSIS for SEL? I like the SSIS a lot. The general SSIS, this is a teacher rating scale that where teachers rate the frequency of both socially skilled behaviors and problem behaviors. I don't know and it's a wonderful tool. I don't know the SSIS for SEL as well, so I can't speak to the rigor of it. But the developers are terrific, and so I'm imagining that they've come up with a pretty good tool. So I think that's a reasonable tool too. The nice thing about the SSIS, not the SEL version, but the SSIS, is that it actually was designed in conjunction with a specific classroom. They call it intervention, but it's more or less a curriculum or a program, so that the assessment really feeds into how you use their program resource. So I actually might be biased towards just the standard old SSIS rather than the SSIS SEL. Yeah.
One of the things that we are hoping to do this year yet is to ask some of these evidence-based, these SEL assessments that are on the RAND and the CASEL guide, if they would align to our competencies, so that you'll have, if you just decide to use the competencies, you know, have identified your competencies of focus, you can kind of then will help you find a tool that will actually assess what you're teaching. So that's one of our plans for that.
I think that is such a great plan, and it's such a great resource that you, Beth, and your team at the state can provide to your district partners, is, you know, help in figuring out how do we line up the policy, what we're doing in the classroom, and what we want to assess. And I think that I provided you with that kind of alignment for our assessment, and I think it would be great to have it for all of them. And I think you've done that form of alignment for programs and curricula too. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep. And so the Cell Labs has actually got that alignment for the K through 6, right?
That's right.
On our website, on the alignment website page. So you can see, and in addition to that, you also provide a really nice sort of explanation about what type of tool, if it's not something that Cell Labs would assess, what type of tool would be a useful tool to assess that particular one, whether it would be a survey or observation. So it's a really nice additional tool for you to take a look at the competencies, the Wisconsin competencies for kindergarten through 6, and how Cell Lab or what other, if not Cell Lab or not direct assessment, what other type of assessment might be appropriate for that competency. Other questions? Okay. My district uses a DESA, but primarily to place kids in Tier 2 interventions. Do you have useful tips on how to approach teachers in utilizing the data universally? That's a good question.
That is a good question. I mean, I'm going to assume that you mean approach teachers in utilizing the DESA data universally. I guess the question, or two questions would be, one is, I know the DESA has the mini version that's like 7 items, and it gives you sort of a global score. And then there's the full version that gives more kind of different scores for different competencies. I'd have to think about how to use the DESA mini universally, because, you know, it's only 7 items and gives you kind of one global score. That's probably a really good estimate kind of overall of kids' social emotional competence, but it's not differentiated enough, I don't think, necessarily to guide specific instructional strategies. Now, if you gave the DESA, the complete DESA for every student, then you might start getting differentiated enough information about the sort of competencies that students have developed well, which ones need work, to do the kind of thing that we talked about earlier in this presentation. That is, sort of decide what to focus on to build on strengths and address needs. But I think that's the full DESA is maybe 72 items or something like that. So that's a lot of questionnaires for teachers to fill out. So there's a real balancing act there. But then the other piece of that question is like, it's not just like, what is the data, but how do you approach teachers in actually coming to grips with, make sense of, and make good decisions based on the data? And that's a pretty big question. I really think that's about like, do you have data review processes already in place that teachers participate in? If so, then you can kind of add the SEL data to that process and hopefully have somebody on the team who is expert at the content and the meaning of the numbers in the DESA, so they can really start helping teachers to use those data as skillfully as they use math and reading data. If not, then finding time to convene teachers and administrators together to discuss the data is going to be a first step, and that's a little bit of a tougher nut to crack, because if you're anything like me, time is the scarcest resource, and it's really hard to find time for a new meeting.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Here's another one. Is there any SEL assessment that disaggregate data by students in poverty, gender? So do you know of the statistical properties of some of these that they actually disaggregate by different populations?
Well, I mean, I think there are two things that leap to mind. One is the surface question, and I'll address that, and the other is maybe an implication of the question. Any SEL assessment data that gives you individual scores, if you can integrate it into your data management system, you could conceivably report it disaggregated by special ed, free and reduced price lunch, ethnicity, gender, whatever you wanted. So that's certainly possible. If you can get individual scores and you got a data management system, you can do that kind of examination. I don't know if it's possible that Panorama has that functionality available in the reporting system, although I couldn't say for sure. We don't in our system, and we've done that because we sort of feel like we actually want people to focus on the whole class and the whole school. Now, we've debated this because we know that people ask about this a lot, but I'd rather that a teacher is saying, what should I do with my whole class to support their learning, than breaking it down by subgroups. Looks like the DESA has that capability too. If you upload the demographics when you load your students into the system on your CSV files, what somebody said. So that's good. DESA's got that. The other part of that question that I'm not sure if this was what the questioner intended, but is one of whether the assessments function the same way for members of different groups, particularly members of different ethnic or cultural groups, but also for boys and girls and kids who have special needs and general ed kids. And that's a question of measurement equivalence. And it is possible for test developers to run rigorous tests of measurement equivalence to evaluate the extent to which an assessment scores mean the same thing for children from different groups. We've done that with our assessments and find really good evidence of measurement equivalence across ethnicity, gender, and language forms we have in English and Spanish. I can't speak to others. Some test developers do that kind of measurement equivalence test, others don't.
Discussion. Other questions? Well, we've kept you actually more time, and we've had questions up till the end of this time. So this has been a pretty pretty good topic for us today. If you are interested in following up, please feel free to email Dr. McGowan. If you have questions for me, most of you know how to reach me. This will be recorded and posted on the website with the PowerPoint as soon as it is closed captioned. If you really, really want this PowerPoint before it's posted, please contact me and I'm happy to email it to you as well. So if there are no other questions, I think we will let you go. I'm going to just briefly share, for those of you that want to hang on here, what the tracker is going to look like. And I will share my screen.
Well, Beth, I'm going to sign off in a sec, but I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to be
absolutely.
To speak with your community, and it was really nice to meet everyone. And you know, it's funny, chat boxes can sometimes a little bit give you a sense of the people behind the screen. It's just a teaser, though, and I hope to get a chance to meet some of you in person at some point.
Well, it'd be great to have you come join us for a conference or something when it's coming up. So I said that in public,
terrific.
just so you know that it's putting it out there. And appreciate all of your consult as well. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Stay warm. Okay. So the plan is to release this on Friday, and it's going to look like this. It's housed at the University of Wisconsin. Just a little added feature so that you don't feel that DPI is collecting any of this information. We've got some examples of how each of these tools can be used. The student SEL tracker is a survey tool that can be taken either by an adult about a student or a student self-assessment for middle and high school. And then we talk about the different ways in which that assessment tool could be used. The Teacher Skills and Practice Survey is for teachers to assess their own social emotional competencies using the Wisconsin competencies, as well as a survey about how they're using teaching practices that will promote and support social emotional learning. Then there's a classroom observation tool, which will allow schools to figure out how to use this how they want, but you might have a peer coach or you might have an SEL coach that uses this tool to also, in addition to a self-report about your classroom, somebody can do a walkthrough to identify whether those teaching practices are occurring and if they're being seen. Each time that you do these, you will receive a report, a very brief, quick report in your email, but you can also request additional reports. And we're working to make sure that they can be designed so that they're useful. You'll be able to access the tracker 4 times throughout the year in the event that you want to use this for formative assessment as well as progress monitoring. And you can get data that will show you the different administrations and make comparisons for you. At least for a while, when we're ready to start this, we're going to include the user feedback. And if you decide to use this tool, we'd really love to hear some feedback from you so that we can improve it. We did a pilot of this, and this is where some of the improvements around the reports that were being made available came from the feedback from people. So that's a quick walkthrough. We will send out a link to this probably on Friday, if not Friday, Monday, and do that through the SEL listserv as well. So I'm happy to take any questions about it quickly, but I know that we're running over time. You certainly can email me if you like. But I thank you for joining us for this webinar. We're excited about the tracker and would really hope to get that you can use it and give us some feedback once you see it. If there's no questions, we will sign off.